Senator Cormann, should the Liberal Party go for a conscience vote on gay marriage?
The Liberal Party has had a long-standing policy position on marriage, and that is that marriage is between a man and a woman. It was, of course, a coalition, the Liberal National Party coalition, that enshrined the definition of marriage into the Marriage Act back in 2004, incidentally with the support at the time of the Labour Party.
But Labor's changed its platform. Malcolm Turnbull has come out calling for a conscience vote. Senator Simon Birmingham has said that he's comfortable with gay marriage and a conscience vote as well. Should Tony Abbott free up Liberal MPs so that they can actually vote according to how they feel rather than be dictated to by the party?
Well, nobody knows what the Labour Party stands for these days. I mean, there was a change in policy platform, but the Prime Minister doesn't support it, and the Prime Minister will vote against Labour Party policy. So, I mean, who knows what the Labour Party stands for these days?
Their MPs are free to do as they choose now. However, Liberal MPs, if Tony Abbott doesn't give a conscience vote, are going to be required to do as the party wants.
Well, I mean, this is a matter, obviously, that will be discussed in the party room. It's not a matter of Tony Abbott dictating anything. This is about the party room making a decision. And, of course, it's a long-standing policy position of the Liberal National Party coalition that marriage is appropriately defined in the Marriage Act as a union between a man and a woman voluntarily entered into for life.
But Tony Abbott says that you can do it without penalty. But in reality, the penalty is if you're a frontbencher, you lose your job.
Well, I have crossed the floor, and I did, on that occasion, step down as a front bencher in the coalition. I mean, obviously, that is all part and parcel of exercising your conscience.
But that's not, as Tony Abbott says, that you can do it without penalty. The penalty is that you lose your job, effectively.
Well, in the Labour Party, if you cross the floor, you're expelled from the party. In the coalition, you are free to express a view, and to express a view that is different from that determined by the party room, subject to going through certain processes. And I mean, that is quite appropriate.
All right, there's an article on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald today saying Swan tax shake-up targets super rich. Now, in essence, he's talking about removing company tax from small businesses and struggling manufacturing businesses, for example, and imposing a super tax of sorts on the big miners and the banks. Now, what do you think of that?
Well, Wayne Swan is a high-spending, big debt and deficit treasurer. He's the worst treasurer that Australia's ever had.
He's the best treasurer according to the International Money Magazine.
For a European money magazine, and I'll just leave that hanging there. I mean, this is a high-spending, high-taxing treasurer. It's a treasurer that has given us record levels of debt and deficit, and he's always casting around for more taxes. I mean, what is being described in the paper today would be shocking. Public policy, shocking public policy. I mean, this concept of targeting success and actually making it less attractive to actually stretch to reach your full potential is just a very bad way of going about it. If you want good tax policy, focuses on being as efficient, as internationally competitive, and least distorting possible. And in order to have a tax system that is least distorting, really, the principle that you should always pursue is broaden the base and lower the rate. The lowest possible rate based on the broadest possible base. That is efficient, less distorting tax policy. And of course, this government is always casting around to impose a new tax. They're always pursuing this politics of envy. Let's pursue the rich. Let's pursue the super rich. I mean, this is a socialist type government which is just completely incompetent at managing our economy over the long term.
Well, socialist government or not, you say that this is a shocking tax, but it looks like it's got some supporters out there. The head of the government's Treasury unit is in favour of it. The Business Council of Australia have offered some tentative support. So has the ACTU, and there's an academic from Melbourne University that has as well. It can't be all bad, given that there are supporters like that.
Well, I mean, the head of the revenue group in Treasury obviously works for the government, and if you've got a Labor government that looks for new taxes and tells Treasury to come up with ways of putting forward their tax proposals, obviously that's what Treasury will do, in the same way as Treasury would work with the coalition government to help us deliver lower, fairer, simpler taxes. I mean, what's described in that story that you're talking about is that this would be a very complex tax, and if we go back to where we started with tax reform when Kevin Rudd, in the good old days, when Kevin Rudd initiated the Henry tax review, it was supposed to be a once-in-a-generation opportunity for root and branch reform of our tax system to make our tax system simpler and fairer. And of course, everything that Wayne Swan has done since then has made our tax system more complex, less fair, and introduced more distortions into our tax system than what we had in the previous circumstance.
It's an interesting calculation, though, isn't it? I mean, I can see that obviously the big banks and the miners, they're not going to like this type of tax if it's going to have them paying an extra 40 or 50%, according to the report. But when we're talking about manufacturing organisations or small business, if they're going to be paying no tax or next to no tax, they're likely to be strongly in favour of an idea like this.
Well, I mean, this whole concept that somehow you can target a few super rich and then spread the benefits to everyone is simplistic and naive. It's the sort of simplistic politics of envy that you get from this incompetent Labor administration. I mean, this is not a sensible contribution to the tax policy debate in Australia. I mean, we should have a tax system that provides incentives to every business across Australia to aspire to be the success story of tomorrow. Like businesses across Australia should be rewarded for getting themselves into a position where they're more and more successful, not get disproportionately penalised for doing well.
But by the same token, this is day one of the reportage of this new tax idea. Is it really appropriate for the opposition to be coming out so stridently against it when you really, let's face it, you could spend more time perhaps considering it and possibly being in favour of it or taking a more nuanced position?
Well, Labor has had a terrible track record when it comes to tax. In the first 4 years of the Labor government, not only have we had $169 billion worth of accumulated deficits, we've had 19 new or increased taxes. Whenever Labor talks about tax reform, invariably what we're getting is just another lazy grab for cash. And none of the difficult decisions have actually, none of the difficult tax reform issues have actually been tackled by this Labor government. This is always, whenever Labor comes up with something, it is always about generating more cash to feed their spending addiction.
Are you worried about yourself being all at sea on this issue and coming out so strongly as you have, and perhaps the coalition moving its position like it did on the superannuation reforms? You were running around the country telling people that it was bad to go from 9 to 12 superannuation, yet Tony Abbott ended up backflipping on that idea, leaving you in a position where essentially you were out of step with your leader.
That's not quite right. Our policy position very clearly is that we are opposed to the increase in compulsory super from 9 to 12%, and of course that was also the recommendation of the Henry tax review. The Henry tax review recommended against increasing compulsory super from 9 to 12%.
Yet now you're supporting it.
Well, we're not supporting it. We voted against it in the House of Representatives a week or two ago, and we'll be voting against it in the Senate early in the new year, and for very good reasons. If you look at the Henry tax review...
But you won't roll it back in government. It sounds like Kim Beazley's opposition to the GST.
Well, no, what we've said is that we think it's bad policy. Like, we are in favour of providing incentives to increase voluntary savings. Labor is increasing taxation on voluntary savings, so reducing incentives for voluntary savings. They're wanting to increase compulsion. Our view is that at 9%, 9% is the right level for compulsory super, and that any further incentives should be targeted at encouraging increased voluntary savings. Now, and I mean, the Henry tax review has actually pointed out that increasing compulsory super further would hurt low and middle income earners the most. Now, what we've said though is that if the government is successful in getting that increase in compulsory super through the Parliament, then we do concede that it would be too complicated and not appropriate to rescind that in government. Now, we've been very open, very transparent and very clear about the sorts of policies like the toxic carbon tax, like the unfair and distorting and complex mining tax. We'll rescind those in government, but we've been very clear in our statements that we think increasing compulsory super beyond 9% is a bad idea. We would target... We would
a bad idea, though, that if elected, you'll continue to legislate once in government.
Well, a bad idea that if the legislation passes through the Parliament, we will not rescind, because we think that, on balance, making constant changes to superannuation is not a good thing. And then, incidentally, like Labor in the lead up to the 2007 election said that they wouldn't make any changes to superannuation, not one jot, not one tittle, I think is what Kevin Rudd said at the time. And then, of course, they proceeded to dramatically reduce concessional contribution rates, which encourage increased voluntary savings from $50,000 and $100,000 down to $25,000.
But just answer me this then: why is it not appropriate to rescind this particular tax, yet it is appropriate, if elected, to rescind the mining tax, the carbon tax, and possibly the pokies reforms if they get legislated?
Well, I mean, the carbon tax is a tax that pushes up the cost of everything, which will make Australia less competitive internationally, which will result in lower real wages, and all of that without doing anything to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So by removing the carbon tax, you're removing a burden out of the economy, a burden on household budgets, and of course that is very important that we do that after the next election. Same with the mining tax. The mining tax is a tax that makes Australia less competitive internationally. It's bad for our economy. Removing it is going to be good for our economy. It means that our economy is going to grow more strongly than it would with the mining tax. Now, when it comes to the increase in compulsory super, once it's legislated, because it is an integral part of wage arrangements and so on, and because clearly people organise their retirement planning around it, it would actually have a disproportionate impact on too many people to start fiddling with it.
The carbon tax, though, has businesses organising how they approach their emission reductions around it. Once it's implemented, you'll get rid of that.
Well, a carbon tax is a serious bit of lead in our saddlebag. I mean, if you look around the world, there's not a single country anywhere around the world that has as comprehensive and as hard-hitting a carbon tax as the Gillard Brown Labor Green government has imposed on Australia. I mean, this is a terrible tax for Australia. It's a terrible tax for international competitiveness. It will make higher emitting businesses in other parts of the world more competitive than even the lowest emitting equivalent business in Australia. And of course, it is a tax that will take $1 trillion out of our economy between now and 2050. The carbon tax means that all of Australia will effectively have to work for nothing for a whole year between now and 2050 to pay for the impact of the carbon tax. It's clearly in our national interest for an Abbott-led coalition government to rescind the carbon tax if we are successful at the next election.
You're watching an interview I conducted with Senator Cormann a little earlier today. When we come back from the break, we'll take a closer look at the coalition's not-so-good costings, as well as what the Senator thinks about the Australia Network contract debacle. You're watching Showdown. Welcome back. You're watching Showdown. Now to the second half of my interview with Senator Matthias Cormann. Okay, change of pace. Last week we saw the MyEFO release, which saw the budget surplus projected for 2012-13 reduced from $3.5 billion to $1.5 billion. Now, I've been as critical as anyone in my writing and commentary on this, but isn't it the case that the opposition will find it every bit as hard to get back to surplus as the government, given the number of spending commitments and removal of taxation measures that are being proposed by your side?
Well, let's just make the point up front that Wayne Swan always gets his forecasts wrong. 12 months ago he said that the deficit this financial year would be $12.3 billion. Then by budget time 6 months later that was $22.6 billion.
Peter Costello always gets them wrong as well.
I would challenge you. Let me just finish my point, but I would challenge you to find that Peter Costello ever got a forecast wrong to that extent. So $12.3 billion deficit 12 months ago became a $22.6 billion deficit in May at the budget, and now a $37 billion deficit come May for this time round. So in 12 months, the deficit for this year has more than tripled. But the government wants us to believe that somehow next year there's going to be this, enormous turnaround, this magic turnaround, and the surplus is not going to be impacted. There's going to be $1.5 billion surplus. It is unbelievable. And if you look at the revenue assumptions or the revenue estimates that Wayne Swan has put forward for 2012-13, they are really, there are serious question marks around the credibility of those revenue estimates. I mean, the government has said in MyEFO that they've downgraded their expectations for the economic growth from 3.75% to 3.25% for 2012-13. Yet they're expecting a dramatic surge, miraculously, a dramatic surge in company tax receipts. I mean, that's just one example. I mean, there are question marks all over the revenue estimates. And no doubt, next year, when the revenue estimates don't eventuate, Wayne Swan is going to pop up again and say, ooh, our revenue has collapsed. Shock horror. And that's no doubt going to be the excuse that he'll use for not meeting the surplus target for 2012-13.
Well, however dodgy the return back to surplus may or may not be, what about the dodginess or otherwise of your costings at the last election? We saw last week reports that the accountancy firm that you used for that have been fined by their peak industry body for inappropriate practice.
Well, there was nothing dodgy about our costings and our budget estimates in the lead up to the last election, and of course we'll go through a very proper, comprehensive and detailed process in the lead up to the next election. And in fact, we're currently going through the Expenditure Review Committee process where we're going through the budget line by line, very carefully, making sure that we identify all of the labour waste that is currently still included in the budget, and of course in the lead up to the next election we will be releasing a very comprehensive set of financial figures.
Well, if there's nothing dodgy about the costings, can you explain to me then why that particular accountancy firm has been fined by their peak body after giving the tick of approval to your costings?
Look, I mean, that's a matter for the accountancy firm to explain.
Well,
I mean,
it should be an issue for the coalition, though, shouldn't it?
I mean, we went through a proper process. We put it all out there for everyone to see, and people have and continue to make their judgments. And from our point of view, we're very comfortable with the costings that we've released in the lead up to the last election.
Will you be using the same accountancy firm at the next election?
Well, look, I mean, that's a matter. That is a matter yet to be decided, obviously.
So you haven't
well, I mean, that is not a decision for me to make. I mean, I think that you're well aware.
The Assistant Shadow Treasurer.
Well, that's right, and of course we've got a comprehensive, we've got a good economic team. We've got a Shadow Treasurer, we've got a Shadow Finance Minister, we've got obviously a leader and a deputy leader, and there's a lot of people involved in these sorts of decisions. It's not going to be my decision to make.
Senator Cormann, one final question on the Australian Network tender process. It's been abolished and the contract awarded to the ABC. Firstly, what do you think of the process involved in that? And secondly, what would the opposition do if it became the government? Look,
I mean, it was a shocking process. It's unfair. I mean, it's clearly just another example of an incompetent government at work. It's interesting to note that the government made the decision, announced the decision while Kevin Rudd was overseas. I mean, like, Sky News is quite entitled to feel very aggrieved about this, and no doubt there's going to be a lot said about this in coming weeks. The government the government clearly has some serious explaining to do, but on the face of it, highly dodgy process, highly dodgy basis for decision making, and you know, I mean, it is just another demonstration of just the incompetence and the untrustworthiness of this Gillard Labor government.
Would you like to see the Liberal Party in government launch a full investigation into this, if given the chance?
Well, I mean, I think there ought to be a full investigation now. I mean, clearly the government has got some serious explaining to do. I wouldn't want to have to wait until after the next election. I mean, clearly, if the government hasn't gone down the path of providing proper answers, then it'll be up to Malcolm Turnbull to explain what we do in government. But clearly there's a lot of explaining to be done here.
All right, Senator Matthias Cormann, thanks very much for joining us on Showdown.
Good to be here.
Coming up